Next up, we have item number 5, and this is a presentation on the unique sea level rise planning challenges and opportunities for the Humboldt Bay. And this will be the first in a series of informational briefings that we are planning in order to highlight and break down the different aspects of sea level rise science and adaptation planning strategies and policy approaches to deal with sea level rise, as well as identify those significant challenges that we and local governments are facing in planning for sea level rise and climate change. And doing these informational briefings outside of a public hearing on specific permits or LCP items, I think allows a more expansive conversation and on these issues and these challenges. And in addition, given we have several new commissioners, I think the time is right to have these sorts of briefings, and it'll also provide some context for the new commissioners about the efforts that we're involved with climate change and sea level rise adaptation across the state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey Ducklow, one of our great environmental scientists in our statewide planning unit, who is on the front lines of adaptation planning efforts across the state. So take it away, Kelsey.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. This item is a presentation to provide the Commission and members of the public with information about the work the Commission and local government staff have been doing to help prepare for sea level rise. I'm going to start today by giving an overview of some of the sea level rise vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning work the Commission has been supporting statewide, before handing things over to Alderon Laird, a local sea level rise planner and co-chair of Humboldt State University's Sea Level Rise Initiative, and John Ford, Director of Planning and Building for Humboldt County, both of whom will be speaking in more detail about the sea level rise challenges the Humboldt Bay area is facing. Next slide. Diving right in 2015, the Commission unanimously adopted its sea level rise policy guidance. This document, which was developed with funding and support from NOAA, provides recommendations for how to incorporate sea level rise considerations into our planning and permitting processes. It contains a set of guiding principles that frame the Commission's work, information on best available science on sea level rise, which was updated again and unanimously adopted last fall, a library of different types of adaptation strategies, and additional information on legal topics and several technical appendices. Most important for today's conversation, the guidance contains step-by-step recommendations for how to assess sea level rise vulnerabilities and begin adaptation planning within both an LCP and CDP context. Next slide. Shown here is a diagram of the steps for addressing sea level rise in LCPs. The first 3 steps, identifying sea level rise projections, analyzing the physical impacts of sea level rise, and assessing risks to coastal resources, make up what is typically called a vulnerability assessment. The last 3 steps are part of the adaptation planning process and include identifying preferred strategies, updating LCP policies, and implementing, monitoring, and revising strategies as necessary. Although the number and detail of individual steps may vary, this is a common planning exercise, and it aligns with guidance from the Ocean Protection Council and other state agencies. Next slide. Honing in on the vulnerability assessment piece a bit more, the guidance provides specific information, best practices, and helpful tools for each step. For step 1, the guidance directs users to identify sea level rise projections relevant to their specific region and planning horizon. Those of you who were here last fall may remember when the science update was completed, that the Ocean Protection Council has provided a new set of sea level rise projections that are considered current best available science. Tables like the one shown here are available for the 12 tide gauges along the California coast and give projections for every 10 years through 2150. Both the OPC and Commission guidance provide additional information on how to choose appropriate projections for different types of planning efforts. Next slide. Step 2 relates to analyzing the physical impacts of sea level rise, including erosion, flooding, inundation, and groundwater change. The guidance provides information on the different sea level rise mapping and modeling tools available in California that help with this step. For example, many jurisdictions have used the USGS Cosmos tool, which is available throughout all of Southern California and the San Francisco Bay Area right now, and will soon cover the entire state. The picture on the right shows the Cosmos tool depicting Newport Beach, where you'll be meeting next month, under about 5.5 feet of sea level rise, which could occur before the end of the century. Sea level rise mapping and modeling work specific to the Humboldt Bay region has also been completed, which Alderon will touch on in just a moment. Next slide. Lastly, using this information, the guidance recommends assessing the risks to coastal resources that fall within these current and future hazard areas. This includes not only identifying what buildings and infrastructure are at risk from sea level rise, but also the beaches, wetlands, agricultural lands, and other natural assets, as well as the environmental and social justice factors that could make certain populations or communities particularly vulnerable. As with the other steps, the guidance provides additional detail about understanding the vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and risk factors for different types of coastal resources. Next slide. Switching gears a little bit, after the sea level rise guidance was initially adopted in 2015, the Commission's sea level rise team completed a statewide vulnerability synthesis to form a baseline understanding about what is at risk throughout the state. This included working closely with district staff to identify areas that are already particularly vulnerable or likely to become vulnerable to coastal hazards, some GIS work, and synthesizing existing information from a variety of resources, including the numerous local vulnerability assessments that had already been completed. A statewide synthesis and individual county snapshots are available on the Commission website. Key findings from this work include that beaches, recreational areas, and critical infrastructure are vulnerable in every single county, that the economic consequences of not adapting to sea level rise could be significant not just to individual communities, but to the state as a whole, and that both LCP updates and interagency and cross-jurisdictional coordination is needed to adequately address growing sea level rise risks. These findings continue to guide the work of the Commission today. I also really want to highlight the importance of local vulnerability assessments. The Commission and other state agencies will, of course, continue to assess sea level rise risks and work with stakeholders to identify and implement appropriate adaptation responses, but adequately addressing sea level rise vulnerabilities will require locally specific responses. The challenges and opportunities facing the Humboldt Bay area right here are significantly different than those facing the urbanized portions of Southern California, as you'll hear more about in just a bit. And developing these local solutions will require a lot of local knowledge. Next slide. To that end, the Coastal Commission, along with the Coastal Conservancy and the Ocean Protection Council, has been supporting local government efforts to complete sea level rise vulnerability assessments. The Commission is now in its 6th year of the LCP Local Assistance Grant Program, and it has awarded $6 million to almost 40 jurisdictions throughout the state. Currently, 32 vulnerability assessments have been completed or are in progress through the grant program, as shown on the map on the left. These assessments typically analyze multiple sea level rise and storm scenarios through the year 2100 and quantify things like the number of houses, commercial structures, and public access ways, length of trails, roadways, and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and acreage of beaches and natural habitats to understand what assets are at risk and when impacts may occur. Some vulnerability assessments also include economic analyses related to what the actual costs associated with sea level rise could be, from damage to built structures to loss of tourism income if beaches are lost. As jurisdictions move into adaptation planning, this kind of information can be compared to the costs and benefits associated with different adaptation options. Additionally, we are starting to see more jurisdictions take a focused look at how sea level rise could differently impact vulnerable populations who live, work, or recreate in coastal areas. As mentioned earlier, this type of locally specific information is critical for ensuring our coastal communities can be resilient to sea level rise in the coming years. So I want to take this opportunity to note that the 6th round of the Commission's grant program to support this type of work was just announced, with applications due on September 6th. Next slide. I'm going to turn the presentation over in just a second, but in order to set the stage for that portion of the presentation, I want to highlight that there is a lot of sea level rise planning work going on right here in the Humboldt Bay area. Humboldt County, Arcata, and Eureka are all working on LCP updates that include sea level rise work. Humboldt and Arcata have both received multiple grants from the Commission, and Eureka received an early grant from OPC. All have completed sea level rise vulnerability assessments. I should also note that just to the north of the Humboldt Bay region, Trinidad is also working on an LCP update and has received 2 Commission grants. Outside of the LCP work, there is focused sea level rise planning going on to address specific assets. For example, critical infrastructure such as Highway 101, which you heard about yesterday, as well as the Arcata wastewater treatment plant. Additionally, the Coastal Conservancy, OPC, and many others have funded pilot and research projects related to sea level rise, including the use of living shorelines to protect vulnerable development along the bay, the vulnerability of the dune system along the North Spit, and possible adaptation options, and numerous wetland restoration efforts. With that, and you can go to the next slide, I'm going to turn the presentation over first to Alderaan Laird and followed by John Ford, and they're going to talk much more detail about all of this great work that's happening here.
Thank you, Kelsey. My name's Alderaan Laird. I'm an environmental planner with Trinity Associates in Arcata, and I have been working on sea level rise vulnerability assessments for the last 10 years on Humboldt Bay. So I'll give you a quick tour on what we've been doing in the Humboldt Bay region. Does this work?
He has a different
That's not-
PowerPoint.
Well, while we're looking for that, Commissioner Almanzada had a question for staff.
Yeah, I was just wondering, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I asked for a standing update on sea level rise at the last meeting, and I'm really impressed that you've been able to put it into action immediately and very timely given yesterday's discussion. I'm wondering, in light of our discussion yesterday, if there's a process in place for the Coastal Commission either to internally sort of audit or consider whether we're adhering to our own sea level rise guidance, or perhaps engage sort of an external entity, because that was one of the things that struck me, is that we do have this guidance, both from principles and specific guidance, and that oftentimes I see inconsistency. And so it would be great if we could set up some kind of annual review of whether the projects that are being considered and approved are consistent with our own principles. And I just wondered if there's a process for that.
We could create a process for that. The question is, the sea level rise guidance allows for a fair amount of latitude. So
Right,
figuring out, how it's complying or not complying with sea level rise guidance may be tricky. But we could certainly noodle on that and figure out a way to report back to you all on how we're applying that, both in the context of permits and then LCP work. We can. We'll come back with you, back to you on that and see what we can do.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would be interesting and could also inform the potential need for, refinement. If, if there's a gap between what we want to do and what we're actually doing, just think it could be useful. Thank you.
Go right ahead.
Okay. This is the Tuluwat World Renewal Ceremonial Site for the Wiyot tribe, and this is an average king tide on Humboldt Bay, you can see here. So just to give you background, historically the salt marsh distribution around Humboldt Bay was extensive. About 60% of the bay was open water and mudflat, and 40% was salt marsh. Today, about 90% of the bay is open water and mudflat, and only 10% of the bay is actually salt marsh. We lost 90% through diking activity that started in 1890 and the construction of the railroad. The shoreline now is 102 miles, and historically it was only 60 miles. One thing of note on Humboldt Bay, the tidal range on a daily, monthly, and annual basis can be as much as 9 feet, so there's some tremendous changes in the environment of Humboldt Bay. This is during a low tide situation. In the Arcata Bay, we have extensive mudflats and tidal channels. We also have the last remaining native Olympia oyster beds in all of California in Arcata Bay. During high tides, the bay is essentially filled right up to the top and at the point of spilling out. And during our king tides, we do have localized flooding occurring around the bay. The Coastal Conservancy funded the first regional sea level rise adaptation and vulnerability assessment work on Humboldt Bay. And in 2010, we embarked on shoreline inventory and mapping. It hadn't been done since 1870, and conducted a vulnerability assessment of the shoreline. And what we found is that 75% of our shoreline is actually artificial structures, the majority being barrier-type structures. Specifically 41 miles of dikes and 11 miles of railroad. As barrier-type structures, if those structures fail, the low-lying areas that are being protected by the structures are flooded on a daily basis today. And that is important given that when we have king tide events and the bay is filled up and the dikes do possibly breach, we don't have a centralized dike district on Humboldt Bay that's responsible for maintaining or repairing the dikes. That's left up to the individual property owners. This was a king tide and storm event in New Year's Eve 2005, and the governor declared a state of disaster on Humboldt Bay because of that water elevation. The other type of barrier structure that we have that's dominant on Humboldt Bay is the Northwest Pacific Railroad that's not in operation. And you can see it's right at water elevation. We have pickleweed growing in the railroad, and that structure is currently protecting Highway 101, which you heard about yesterday. When you look at shoreline cover on the bay, we have 9 miles of exposed shoreline. This is what a diked area looks like that's actively eroding. Should it breach, we would have flooding, as I mentioned earlier. When you look at salt marsh distribution on Humboldt Bay, it used to be extensive, now it's really scarce. But shoreline or living shoreline protection is what we like to talk about now. You can see here when we have salt marsh in front of a shoreline structure that needs to be protected, like the 101 corridor you heard about yesterday, it does a good job in reducing the height and energy of waves. And where we don't have salt marsh, we get exposure and erosion occurring right on the shoreline. The other thing that we did during the shoreline inventory is we created a shoreline elevation profile in a 1 meter distance around the entire bay, so we could identify what areas are within 1 or 2 feet of our mean monthly high tide. And I just wanted to show you here, 9.5 feet was considered warranted declaration of disaster by the governor in 2005, and that's less than a foot higher than our average king tides. We're not talking about a lot of water. We have had breaches on Humboldt Bay, and when the dikes breach, hundreds of acres are flooded with salt water on a daily basis, and again, this is on private property. What we found doing the shoreline inventory on Humboldt Bay is that when water elevation rises to a point of about 10 feet, and that's NEVD 88 elevation, we reach a tipping point where we start overtopping the barrier structure shoreline on Humboldt Bay. When the water elevation goes from 10 to 11 feet, we get a significant jump in the amount of area or mileage that would be overtopped on Humboldt Bay. That's critical. That is unique to our area. We're not talking about the end of the century when reaching these water elevations. We could be reaching these today. This is a dike shoreline that's actively eroding that could possibly breach. This is the tidal extent today in Humboldt Bay with the dikes intact during mean high water. If the dikes start to breach and we get water penetrating through them, this would be the area that would be inundated today, not with sea level rise, but today with the mean higher high water. And this is the 101 corridor you were looking at yesterday. It's being protected by earthen dikes that are on actually California Department of Fish and Wildlife property. The Caltrans actually does not own the shoreline anywhere on Humboldt Bay. The shorelines that are protecting the Highway 101 corridor are either the railroad or earthen dikes owned by other individuals. So again, looking at this tipping point that we discovered on Humboldt Bay, if we go from roughly 10 feet, the areas in red would be beginning to be overtopped. And when we jump to 11 feet, you can see the huge increase in the area that would be overtopped. And so looking at vulnerability based on shoreline erosion or shoreline elevation, 59 miles of the 102 miles are rated highly vulnerable. One of the things that we run into difficulty is when you look at shoreline structures, water doesn't really recognize property boundaries or legal jurisdictions, and we need to have as a basic strategy that we are managing areas and developing adaptation plans for hydrologic units. There's 23 hydrologic units that have a dike shoreline on Humboldt Bay, and the county has assessed all of those areas and developed a priority list and ranking for diked subunits based on the number of assets that are being protected by those dike shorelines. So this is what the shoreline is going to continue to change. It's not in a static state. It's dynamic. This is the iconic eucalyptus trees that you heard about yesterday along the 101 corridor that are slated for removal. And when we look at sea level rise, when we leave the existing conditions and vulnerability on Humboldt Bay and we start to look at sea level rise, we greatly benefited by research that was done by Cascadia Geosciences led by Jay Patton, who looked at vertical land trends or tectonic subsidence in our area. And then our local engineer, Jeff Anderson with Northern Hydrology and Engineers with funding from the Coastal Conservancy, developed a hydrodynamic model specific to Humboldt Bay and generated tidal inundation maps in 1 foot intervals for us to use in our vulnerability assessment. And so what we found with the work that Cascadia Geosciences did is there's a rather unique situation in our area north of Cape Mendocino. We have the highest rate of sea level rise on the entire west coast of the United States. The North Spit tide gauge, which is highlighted there in blue with 4.73 millimeters per year, is the highest rate of sea level rise. And right next to us is Crescent City, is the other extreme. It's the lowest rate of sea level rise in the entire west coast of the United States. Past sea level rise coastal documents that looked at the whole region mischaracterized the situation in our area because they looked at representational tide gauges, and they would always look at Crescent City and say north of Cape Mendocino is really not in a situation that needs to be addressed right away, yet we have the highest rate of sea level rise. OPC corrected that oversight when they issued their sea level rise guidance in 2018. And when you look at the sea level rise projections OPC provided, we reached that 2-foot water elevation threshold possibly by 2040, and we reached the 3-foot threshold by 2060. So we're not talking about the end of the century. We're talking about 20 to 40 years time frame in order to do the planning, the engineering, and do the implementation that's necessary to protect assets in Humboldt Bay. We've been, the Conservancy funded the regional adaptation planning and vulnerability assessments on Humboldt Bay. The City of Eureka has, and the City of Arcata have completed vulnerability assessments. The county has completed vulnerability assessments in general on Humboldt Bay, but they also did a focused dike shoreline sea level rise study. And they also embarked on looking at vulnerability and adaptation for communities at risk. We have 3 unique communities on Humboldt Bay in the county's jurisdiction. With 3 feet of sea level rise, 1 meter, which could occur by 2060, there's 2 communities on Humboldt Bay that would cease to exist, and these are King Salmon and Fields Landing. This is just by 2060, 40 years is the time frame we're talking about. They already experienced king tide flooding in their communities. The stormwater drainage is back up, the shorelines are overtopped. And the problem with these low-lying communities which were built on former tidelands is that even if we built dike barriers or tidal barriers around those areas, the low-lying ground would be subject to rising groundwater in response to sea level rise. We have seawalls, on a major seawall across from the entrance of Humboldt Bay that's being impacted now. Jetties essentially focus all the wave energy right at this point. Behind the railroad tracks is a major sewer line for a local community services district and Highway 101. And looking historically at what has occurred since the jetties were constructed on Humboldt Bay, again, they focused all the energy on the shoreline to the east. And in a period of 70 years, we experienced about 1,500 feet of shoreline retreat and erosion. And today there's a seawall at the base of the bluff that eroded 1,500 feet. This seawall would be overtopped with 2 meters of sea level rise. And what's particularly disturbing is that the spent nuclear fuel storage installation that PG&E has is only 115 feet from the bluff. With 2 meters of sea level rise, it overtops the seawall. We saw 1,500 feet of bluff retreat in 70 years. This is really an exposed structure that when the commission required PG&E to do a sea level rise assessment, the commission said essentially this facility is going to be here in perpetuity and it needs to be addressed. It's a critical feature on Humboldt Bay. If we look at 2 meters of sea level rise on Humboldt Bay and just exactly what it would impact, you can see that the bay itself really expands. The open water mudflat goes up to about 33,000 acres. It's about 18,000 acres now, and we gain about 3,000 acres of salt marsh. But if you look at where the utility infrastructure has been placed on Humboldt Bay, it's been placed on all of the diked former tidelands that are being protected by dike shorelines, yet none of the utility service providers own any of the shorelines. They're not maintaining it. We have PG&E's gas lines, there are electrical transmission towers, we have municipal water transmission lines, sewer lines, lift stations, optical fiber lines. All of that infrastructure has been put in probably the most vulnerable location on the Humboldt Bay region. Humboldt Bay's power generating plant is subject to being totally inundated with a little more than 1 meter of sea level rise. And wastewater treatment facilities like the city of Eureka's are essentially out in the bay. And we have sewer lines and lift stations. Lift stations are electrical devices. They don't respond well to saltwater inundation. And again, the King Salmon and Fields Landing area. We have major municipal water transmission lines. Trying to do this type of emergency repair under 10 feet of tidal water on a daily basis could be difficult. The electrical transmission lines will be out in the bay. And when we look at the transportation infrastructure, and you talked about that yesterday somewhat, there's 11 different segments of Highway 101 that would be inundated with 1 meter of sea level rise, and 46 segments of local streets and roads that would be inundated. That's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be addressed all at the same time. And we are having Nueces flooding, and the king tides will continue to go up in elevation. If we look at the existing surface elevation and we overlay rising water elevations from sea level rise, we'll see that the intertidal habitats will migrate with sea level rise. With 0.5 meter of sea level rise, you can see that the mudflat environment expands, the salt marsh environment contracts. With 1 meter and 1.5 meter, actually the open water bay and eelgrass expands, mudflat and salt marsh becomes a fringe band around the perimeter of the bay. And so the dike lands are the most vulnerable area on Humboldt Bay. Those are agricultural production areas, but they're also where the utilities and transportation are. But they also are critical wildlife grazing areas, and they were a principal factor in the recovery and delisting of the Aleutian geese population in the United States. So dike barriers are not a long-term solution to sea level rise because essentially we have we do not have an unlimited drainage capacity. We have low-lying areas that receive stormwater runoff, and they have nowhere to go but to the bay. And so as the sea level rise raises up, mean low water rises up, the tide gates are less efficient, they don't drain, we lack the capacity, the areas convert to open water. Rising groundwater, as you can see on the left with 1 meter of sea level rise, becomes emergent water. And with 2 meters of sea level rise, we see a huge expansion of groundwater. So even if the dikes were at a 20-foot elevation and totally intact, we would still lose all the land behind those dikes. So they are really a temporary feature because of emergency groundwater. Looking at overall the entire bay, if the dikes fail or when they're compromised, the area in blue would be inundated on an annual basis. And the area in red would be the expansion with 2 meters of sea level rise. So really, we're threatened today with our existing structure on the shoreline, and sea level rise is really just accelerating us looking at the problem and addressing the problem. And the expansion from sea level rise will not be as significant as the historical legacy that those dikes are exposing us to. So what can we do about sea level rise, and how do we gonna adapt, and who's gonna do it? That's the big question on Humboldt Bay. Dikes can protect low-lying areas for a little while. We can elevate, living structures so that they're above, the extreme flood elevation. We can move assets. The PG&E power plant doesn't need to be on the coast. It's not water cooled like the nuclear power plant was. But can we really relocate an entire community? I don't think so. I think relocation is a misnomer. What we're really doing is abandoning an area and withdrawing. And there was some concern expressed yesterday of creating a sea level rise hazard zone, and that would impose, limitations on development. Well, if you look at other flood hazard zones that are already in place, such as FEMA's 100-year flood or the tsunami zone, and you look at the inundation footprint for just 1 meter, we're talking about the same real estate, the same landscape. So managing for sea level rise is not a new imposition on building in a flood hazard area. One of the key things that is, I think, relatively unique in California is the amount of state-retained jurisdiction on Humboldt Bay. All the former tidelands are in state-retained jurisdiction, which means the development is subject to your approval through coastal development permits. And the local coastal programs are really, their jurisdiction and their effect is outside of the actual area that's threatened by sea level rise. So it's really, But we want to try to address adaptation for communities at risk, like King Salmon and Fields Landing. All of those communities are in your jurisdiction, not the county's jurisdiction. So if the county develops adaptation policies in their LCP, you're not bound by those LCP policies. You are adhere to Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act. We need to bridge that gap where you are certifying the LCP with those adaptation policies. And it would be real helpful if you followed the LCP in the review of development and helped with regional planning on Humboldt Bay. We had a regional planning effort for sea level rise that ended in 2015. I think it's time to resurrect that effort and to have the county and the commission as co-leads lead that regional planning effort, to bring Caltrans in and all the other entities. So we look at the bay as a whole, as a unit. We can't look at it parcel by parcel. And then the last slide is that there are ongoing activities. The LCP updates are all in process for all the authorities on the bay. As you heard yesterday from Hank Seaman, the county is doing a sea level rise adaptation plan for the transportation infrastructure that covers half of the corridor. Humboldt State University has formed a sea level rise initiative. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing a coastal resiliency project to see how the dune environment will respond to sea level rise. And lastly, USGS is bringing their coastal storm modeling system to the North Coast in Humboldt Bay. And with that, I would thank you.
Well, there's a wake-up call if I ever heard one.
Do you have any questions?
Wow. Oh, my God, yeah, we'll have plenty of questions. But first,
There's one more presentation as part of this from John.
oh, I'm sorry, who is this?
John Ford from Humboldt County is coming up.
Oh, come right ahead. Thank you.
Hi, John Ford. I'm the Director of Planning and Building for the County of Humboldt. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you a little bit about sea level rise. It is every once in a while we get to confront a once in a lifetime issue and be on the cutting edge of it, and this is certainly one of those issues that requires thought and a lot of patience. I will be brief. Alderon Laird addressed a lot of what I would like to say, but I'd like to focus just on one very difficult regulatory decision point. And as I lead into that, we saw that 1 meter of sea level rise results in potential impacts to infrastructure, including transportation, utility, recreational, environmental. I do want to dwell a moment on economic, because a lot of the tidelands around the bay in particular are the economic hub of Humboldt County. Our livestock and livestock products contribute about $200 million a year to Humboldt County's economy. That's significant. I'd also like to point out, as Alderon mentioned, King Salmon, Fields Landing, and Fairhaven, Finntown. These are residential communities. They're not only residential, but they are the location of a significant amount of the affordable housing stock for Humboldt County. They provide housing for low and moderate income housing households. And so how we deal with that does raise some social justice concerns. I do want to thank staff, as we have worked for the Coastal Commission, as they have been working through this. We've all been evolving in our understanding and approach to this together. It is difficult. As we've been struggling with it at the county level, we're trying to develop a rational policy direction to propose to our policymakers. Where we're heading right now revolves around identifying the critical infrastructure and identifying the steps needed to protect that, maintain that well into the future. We need to protect the economy of Humboldt County, and some of that involves rethinking, taking a serious look at our eroding dikes and levees, as Alderon pointed out, how to protect those now and into the future for as long as is practical. It also involves protecting vulnerable communities for as long as possible, because these often do represent people's lifetime investment. They are the most significant thing they have. These aren't novel ideas, but they have significant policy implications on the decisions that need to be made and how they get made. I really only want to focus on one slide, and this is a slide showing Humboldt Bay. The yellow shows 1 meter rise. One of the areas that is particularly of interest is, if I can, is in this area right down in here. We have Arcata here, we have Eureka over here, and the city limit of Eureka comes down to about here, Arcata comes over to here, and so the county really has a limited area in here. And so in order to develop a strategy there, it really requires the city of Eureka, the city of Arcata, the county of Humboldt to work cooperatively to make something happen. But there is something more significant here that Alderon alluded to, and it does not show up well on this slide, and I apologize. It has to do with the Coastal Commission retained jurisdiction, and that is basically all this area in here. What's that? Oh, the red line is the Humboldt Bay area plan. The California Coastal Commission jurisdiction is the hashed area. And so there are the black hash lines in there. And
Excuse me, just to interrupt, do we have printed copies of these so we could see it better?
I'm sorry I did not bring a printed
But
copy.
we can
Okay.
certainly get some printed copies for you.
Yeah, that would be good, because it's been very hard to really see the details. We get the gist of it, but thanks. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And no, thank you for taking the time to struggle with this. Is that so in this situation, Eureka, Arcata, the county could come up with a collaborative approach that works well to address that area. But then the permitting will always be in the jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission. And one of the things that has historically been the position of the Coastal Commission is that the LCP is not the regulatory document that's used as the underlying authority, it's always the Coastal Act. And so the LCP becomes more of a recommendation. And so that sometimes leads to situations where the LCP is not precisely followed. So in this case, Eureka, Arcata, the county of Humboldt could come up with amazing plans to respond to sea level rise. And this Coastal Commission in the next couple of years could adopt the county's LCP, the city of Eureka's LCP, the city of Arcata's LCP, but in the future, when those improvements actually need to be permitted, if the Coastal Act is followed and the LCP is not adhered to, it may be that those plans can't be implemented because at that time people see or decide, a Coastal Commission decides, that those improvements are not consistent with the Coastal Act as opposed to the LCP. And so I'd just like you to have a sense of that tension for a moment, because in order to have stability, in order to do long-term planning, it's very important that there is agreement on what the long-term plan is. So in order to protect existing local agriculture, in order to protect vulnerable communities, in order to protect the infrastructure that supports those, all of this is in the retained jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission. And what we would ask, very simply, is that as we develop the LCP and that you partner and your staff partners with us, that when you certify it, that you would voluntarily take on the responsibility of implementing that. Because we believe that that will give the certainty to provide grants, to provide property owners with the certainty to apply for projects that are responsive to sea level rise and give Humboldt County the ability to take actions to at least preserve the economy, local communities, and infrastructure to the extent that we can in the circumstances we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Jack, just for clarification, Mr. Ford, right, is your name? Mr. Ford was saying that a certified LCP is not the guidance document you use for all development. I thought
Well, in
It
the
is.
areas of our retained jurisdiction, the standard reviews, the Coastal Act. That
Oh,
does
I
not-
see what you're saying. I'm
yeah.
sorry, I
And so
misunderstood.
that does not mean, though, we can't use, and we got to think outside our normal
Yeah, no kidding.
statutory, sort of framework in many cases. So we can use we can certify an LCP for the areas within the coastal zone, but it can only be used as guidance in our decisions
I see.
going forward. But it can be used as very clear guidance.
I would hope so.
And I
Okay, now,
imagine,
thank you for that. That's important.
Louise, do you want to add anything to that? She's over there looking at me.
I was just going to say
When
that,
Louise looks at you.
no, it's basically what Jack was saying, but we do use LCPs as guidance on a number of different permits along the way. And one good example would be Venice, where we use the LUP as guidance frequently. And that's not a fully certified LCP, but yeah, but it's sort of the same thing when we have a certified LUP on appeal that we use that as guidance. It would be a similar situation where we have a fully certified LCP that we use as guidance, and we follow it. I think the only times when there's some tension with the certified LCP and the Coastal Act is when the LCP is pretty outdated. And so there may be issues with incompatibility, but that should not be the case here, where it's all being certified and then basically immediately implemented.
Yeah.
Okay, I have speakers. Jennifer Savage. How much time?
Just a couple minutes, fine. Yeah.
It's fine.
Jennifer Savage, Surfrider Foundation. On behalf of our more than 20 California chapters and clubs and thousands of members, activists, and supporters, I want to say thank you to Commissioner Amanzada and to staff for today's presentation and for ensuring that comprehensive sea level rise updates will be a standing item on the agenda. We spend so much time talking about specific projects, but since all of California faces loss of beaches, of property within our economy because of sea level rise, providing this opportunity regularly to discuss at length both local concerns and statewide impacts gives the public a better opportunity to understand and to plan accordingly. I happen to live on the peninsula right across the bay here, and so have a personal interest of knowing what to expect in the future. And of course, Surfrider is dedicated to protecting beach access through coastal preservation. A California without beaches would be a very different state, but with the current predictions of beach loss, not an unforeseeable one for many coastal communities. As you know, the economic impact of sea level rise is anticipated to be more costly than even earthquakes or wildfires. Unfortunately, a slow-moving disaster seems less urgent by its nature, and so we have yet to respond to it with the swift and aggressive policies that might stave off the worst consequences. And I'm sorry I'm being so doom and gloom this morning, but I just wanted to really say we, again, appreciate the Commission and staff's commitment to ensuring compliance with the Coastal Act, to push for conditions that will be the most proactive when it comes to our beaches and our bluffs, and for striving to encourage communities to think long term. These updates should serve well in furthering these goals. So thank you.
Thank you. Joanne McGarry.
Hello again, my name's Joanne McGarry. Remember the golden rule, that's what I talked about earlier. But this time around, I've been known in other public speaking avenues to be Joanne McGreta, because I am highly, highly influenced by that young 16-year-old Swedish climate activist, Greta Thunberg, whose profile picture on Facebook is of her half underwater because of sea level rise. And Alderon Laird's presentation and his earlier presentations I have heard, I see how they have impacted me and have impacted you this morning. And this is a very important issue. And one of the things Greta inspires me about is she says, you don't have to listen to me, but you have to listen to the science. And you have to understand equity is an important component in how we make our decisions. So I just really appreciate you understanding the uniqueness of what Humboldt Bay represents in terms of the climate crisis, sea level rise, and how we need to deal with it. And when I talked about history earlier on, a lot of that was human history, but the natural history of this place is equally important. And I think when discussion was happening yesterday about the 101 corridor, we can rise above all of this to create successful future for our community in this area. So thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Colt?
Hello again. Thank you for taking my light speaker card. My name's Jennifer Colt. I'm the director of Humboldt Bay Keeper, and I'm a founding member of the Humboldt State University Sea Level Rise Initiative, along with Alderon Laird. I just want to highlight a few things that that Alderon talked about, which is now you know we have twice the rate of sea level rise here on Humboldt Bay as the state average. And there's been an amazing amount of work, mostly by Alderon Laird and some of his partners, on vulnerability assessments over the last decade or so. But now comes the hard part. How are we going to use that knowledge and adapt to what we know is coming? Yesterday's 101 Corridor Project hearing was a case study in how we're not adapting, I would say. So in addition to Highway 101, the railroad corridor, which will soon hopefully be a trail corridor, PG&E's long-term nuclear waste storage facility that Alderon spoke about, that's 150 or 115 feet from the edge of an eroding bluff. Several communities and power lines, sewer lines, water lines. There are a number of projects that will be coming before you that are setting up more conflict with local and state agencies. Some of them are wastewater treatment facility upgrades in the cities of Eureka and Arcata, which are being driven by regional board requirements for outdated systems that are very low lying because they're gravity based. So if you spend millions and millions of dollars, they're both talking about $40 to $50 million upgrades to their wastewater treatment facilities. They're going to be inundated by sea level rise within the life of those projects. What are we going to do about that? The city of Arcata rejected its LCP update after going through the Coastal Commission process in, I think it was 2013 or so, in large part because they objected to sea level rise policies being included. So we see all over the state LCP updates being driven by grants from the Coastal Commission to the local LCP authorities that die on the vine because the local agencies don't want to do the hard work of telling people we can't be developing in these areas anymore. The county continues to develop in the 100-year flood zone, and outside the coastal zone, we have to pay $2,200 to appeal those permits. Very unfortunate situation. And the city of Eureka just annexed the former mill site that's on the 101 corridor on the bay side of the highway. And their plan is to bring before you sewer and water extensions so they can redevelop that site. So as you can see, there are lots of things to worry about. Will species adapt is a big worry, but will we adapt remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's my last speaker. Shall I just bring it to the commission? Okay. Who'd like to start? Commissioner Brownsy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to thank Sarah and the staff and Mr. Laird and Mr. Ford for the presentations. I have to say that that this was catastrophic, really, to hear this data. And it's almost like we're hearing the telling of a story about the end of a city if this region does not act. And human nature is not necessarily rational, certainly when it comes to these kinds of difficult, complicated, almost overwhelming situations. But if ever there was a place in the state of California where these issues must be addressed full on and with all deliberate speed, it's Humboldt Bay and the surrounding cities. I think I want to, if Mr. Laird could come back up, I have a couple questions. One is, thank you so much. Your work is stunning and so important.
Thank you.
What is the reception of this information to the political and business leadership of this area?
Well, I'd say the first reaction is shock. And, people have been living behind these dikes for over 100 years and everything looks normal. And it's only at king tides that we start seeing a few things. And we've only had a couple of breaches in the last 10 years. I think it's new information. And frankly, the local governments they have capital improvement programs that they aren't fully funded. And they're looking at a whole lot of infrastructure work that needs to be done. The county's hazard mitigation planning process, which is going on right now, they're looking at sea level rise for the first time and realizing that's a major hazard that they haven't planned for in the past, that they need to. And so I think that there are a lot of areas in Eureka and in Arcata that won't be directly affected by sea level rise. It's mostly, the dike former tidelands that are agricultural, that have linear utility infrastructure on it, but not necessarily major business and residential areas. We have a couple of communities, 3 communities that are at risk, but the majority of Arcata and Eureka aren't. But the future of Humboldt Bay as a seaport is actually being threatened by the processes that will be changing. And so as a rural part of California, we're going to need state and federal assistance because we can't do this on our own. And we really appreciate the Commission and the Conservancy and OPC funding all of the work that's been done over the last decade, or nothing probably would have been done.
Do you know if there has been any economic analysis in terms of the costs to the city and county governments with respect to the adverse impacts of sea level rise, to the infrastructure, to the revenue that's generated in this area?
The hazard mitigation planning work that the county is doing, they did do an economic sea level rise assessment, and it was based on assessor parcel records of the value of the properties and the values of the development, the number of people that would be affected. And I asked them to break it down by jurisdiction, by the cities and the county. And they have done that. They haven't released that report yet, but that's the first economic assessment that I've seen. There's been probably individual assessments, such as City of Arcata, what it's going to cost to protect our wastewater treatment facility and the areas that are vulnerable, but I don't have those figures at my hand.
Mm-hmm. If you were in a position to direct the city and county efforts to address sea level rise, what would be your first actions given the nearness of the impacts to the infrastructure and the flooding?
First thing I would do is have the 3 LCP authorities join or create sort of a joint powers authority, and have the Coastal Commission be a party to that, and do all of the vulnerability and adaptation planning on a regional basis, and not limit it to the jurisdictions which have no bearing on the hydrologic units on the bay, and move together as a region and try to secure funding to implement adaptation as a region. And I think we would be much stronger and much more effective if we did that.
I think that's all of my questions for you at this moment. Thank you so much, Mr. Laird. Jack, in response to what Mr. Laird just said, I mean, what can we as a commission, can the staff and can Sacramento do to facilitate that recommendation?
Yeah, I really agree with Alderon on this idea, this regional planning type effort and creating some sort of authority to implement that approach. And I think we need to stress to the powers that be, particularly in Sacramento, that this is no longer a slow-moving emergency. This is ground zero for sea level rise. We need almost something like a Marshall Plan or something to deal with this crisis. Because as Commissioner Wilson pointed out, this isn't the hotbed of political power in California. So we need to take, as we talked about in the local government workshop, of going together to Sacramento to inform our legislators and also the resources agency on this incredible disaster that's about to occur in this area, and really focus on getting resources for planning, but then design and engineering of adaptation projects going forward. And that's going to take a huge amount of resources. And I'm not sure that California is prepared or understands how much funding is going to be required to move this sort of infrastructure or deal with just infrastructure alone. And then how to deal with, and some of these areas could be, I think some buyout programs might be appropriate for certain areas, particularly agricultural areas there. And then, maybe lease back to the agricultural users there for a period, until the areas are inundated. And there's all sorts of restoration type efforts we can do in those areas as well. So it's going to take the intersection of all of these, entities, because it's such a complex web of issues. As you start drilling down to it, you can't look at it linearly. It is a complex web of issues, and as John and Alderon laid out today, it is incredibly complex. And then you start getting into the political issues surrounding that and constituent issues. People are comfortable with the status quo, and any change is going to be really incredibly difficult. And that's a challenge that we've seen up and down the state as we've been on the front lines of adaptation planning up and down the state. Many jurisdictions aren't ready for the type of change that's going to be necessary to really protect our communities and deal with sea level rise going forward. So those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I just have one comment and then I'll be finished. The thing that I fear the most is that inaction will lead to a terrible situation of winners and losers in terms of these communities. If this issue is not addressed comprehensively, the inequities within and outside of these communities is going to be profound, and I believe possibly very difficult for communities to recover from. And so with all of this information, it just so underscores to all of us how important it will be to address these issues as substantively as possible, because the alternative will change who we are as a state. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And before I turn the mic over to Commissioner Amizada, I would just like to say to Mr. Brown, I think it might be a very good addition to our workshop, ongoing workshop with the local governments, if you guys could appoint someone from your district to join with us. And we have some information that's coming out, so maybe the staff can keep you informed of that, because I think just my looking at it, and of course I don't speak for the whole state, but looking at it, I still feel that this is, as you said, ground zero, and could be, because I know the state loves pilot projects, it seems to me that this could be indeed, without having to go, oh my God, the whole coast. This is the part of the coast that's so threatened so quickly. We can do a lot of those things regionally here, and then have a great idea about what's going to happen in other places and apply the knowledge that we have. Anyway, Commissioner Almanzado.
Could Alderon come back to the mic, please? Mr. Lane. Thank you so much for your presentation and work. I wanted to talk briefly about resources. You mentioned yesterday and today as well that the planning process had ceased and that you wanted to resurrect it. And I wonder if we could just briefly talk about the resources needed to do that, and then more broadly to implement some of your recommendations. But let's start with that. So what kind of resources would it take to reinitiate that process?
I don't think very much at all. I think that we have the local staff that participated in the last regional planning effort. We had public work directors, planning directors, and other staff, Caltrans, PG&E, all the major landowners like the Wildlife Refuge. It just takes a little bit of resources to have somebody appointed who's the focal point for bringing it together and coordinating, because everybody else has a lot of other tasks that they're doing. And I think it was a pretty minor effort of, I believe our Coastal Conservancy grant was on the order of $10,000 for 2 years,
Okay.
per year. So it's not a huge effort. We all live here on Humboldt Bay, so there's not travel expenses of like going to San Francisco.
Okay.
So it's just a matter, when we did it the first time, one of the big products that we delivered with the regional planning effort was the hydrodynamic modeling and tidal inundation maps. That was specialized work, but that's been done, and USGS is updating Cosmos to provide us with new mapping products. So really it's a matter of taking the vulnerability data that's been generated and the inventory data that's been generated and start collaborating to figure out strategically how do we address and what areas do we address first, and just have it as it's more of a regional educational forum on how to move forward together.
Great, so relatively small amount of resources to start that process again. And then have you ever identified what the resources needed would be to implement some of your recommendations? You had 4 or 5 sort of general recommendations. Have you started to budget those out?
The county looked at the dike lands and wanted to look at what would be feasible or what's possible in this day and age to do that. And just looking at the reconstruction of the dikes based on the ground elevation and the amount of freeboard you might want to have with 1 meter of sea level rise, it worked out to about $2.7 million per mile to
Okay.
rebuild a dike. So if we move a dike inland or we rebuild the dike where it's located, we're talking about a fair amount of money. There's 41 miles of dikes, but we did prioritize the dikes. So not all 41 miles would need to be treated, but there's that expense. There's also the issue of where do you find the fill? Where do you find the rock? And then you need to have willing landowners that want to participate, because again, there's not a shoreline district on Humboldt Bay. We have the harbor district that has development jurisdiction but not management jurisdiction.
And did you have an opportunity to weigh in on the redesign alternatives considered by Caltrans? I know that you were involved in the vulnerability assessment, but I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, I was part of the team that we developed alternatives and what were considered feasible, for that region. In the short term, raising the elevation of the highway is something that existing operations can handle. It's not anything special to do. Ultimately, the only long-term solution is putting it on a causeway.
Right.
And once you put it on a causeway, essentially you're releasing the bay to reclaim its former tidelands, and Bay is going to do that anyways in a matter of time as it overtops the shoreline. But if you do it as part of an adaptation project, there's implications on how do you mitigate the impacts from doing that. But relocating Highway 101 was not considered economically feasible or environmentally feasible. It needs to go up, and the bay needs to be allowed to go underneath it.
And what might we consider as as the next sort of set of either transportation or other public infrastructure come before us in order to implement our own sea level rise planning principles, but also from your perspective as a technical expert, what should we know as a commission?
I think it would be important to know, one, is it feasible to actually relocate, highway structure or transportation infrastructure? If that's not really feasible given the setting like it is on Humboldt Bay, then it's really a matter of how much planning and implementation time do you have? It takes Caltrans a long time to develop a major project and be ready to build it, maybe 10, 20 years of lead time. And so we need to know and prioritize up and down the state what areas need to be addressed first, irregardless of whether they have the population base to warrant, new construction. It's just that we're in an exposed situation. Other areas may not be exposed till, the end of the century.
Right.
So I think you need to prioritize where do we put our energies in our directions.
And I believe the current transportation analysis is set to wrap up in 2021. Is that right, Jeremy?
There is a statewide effort that we're undertaking to do adaptation and vulnerability assessments throughout the state. And the one for District 1, which includes this area, is set for 2021, I believe was on the slide that was presented by our staff.
And is 2021, from your perspective, going to be an adequate time to sort of identify the findings and recommendations? Is that, as a scientist, do you feel comfortable with that time frame that we currently have?
For our area here on Humboldt Bay?
Yes.
We have already completed the vulnerability assessment on Humboldt Bay. The statewide assessment, is really building on what District 1 did. As part of our regional adaptation planning effort, we selected the Highway 101 corridor for the entire length of Humboldt Bay to assess the vulnerability and come up with adaptation strategies. And then that was in turn used by District 1's climate change pilot study. And so we know each segment of Highway 101 and 255 when they would be exposed to inundation and how high they need to be elevated. So District 1 has the information to begin the planning process on how are they going to adapt to those situations. It may be different in other areas like the Eel River Delta or going up to Crescent City. They may not have that vulnerability assessment in place. And so the 2021 would be, a doable time frame to get that information started. But we already have it. We don't need to wait.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to volunteer, essentially, to be in the team that goes to Sacramento to get the resources for this, and I'd love to invite you, Alderon, to join us.
Sure.
I have a great amount of hope in the environmental leaders of this administration, and I think if we're able to share the data and the information that you've shared with us, it's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be support for resources to initiate the planning process, accelerate the planning process, start to think through the implementing the recommendations as well. So I hope you'll join me.
Yes, I'd look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam
Jack?
Chair, just on the resources side, we do have $1.5 million in grant funding available that these entities can apply for, and this would be a perfect fit for this type of planning effort going forward. So we've talked about and we've encouraged the local governments here to apply for that in more of this regional context too, a coalition of them together.
But just as an informational item for myself, when we have such good information on a local area that, I mean, it's actually stunning. Why is that not distributed to all the agencies who are also struggling to do the same thing? I mean, Caltrans is spending tons of money, and of course yours is a statewide issue, but in this area it may not even be needed to do any more work since we have such...
And those efforts in this area, they are all the entities are coordinating together.
But I mean, is this information getting to them so they go, oh my God, okay, I've got this plugged in.
Absolutely.
Did you tell me now?
Yes, the information that's been developed on Humboldt Bay, the tidal inundation mapping, it's being used by the current sea level rise adaptation project that the county's leading up for transportation infrastructure. All of that work, they're building on that work and refining and adding to it right now. So we're definitely not reinventing the wheel. We're using what's been done over the last 10 years and moving forward.
Great, and then I'm thinking of the state as well. I mean, they're trying to map out the whole thing, and if you just use the puzzle pieces created by yourself and other locals, I mean, it would save a lot of resources and would speed up the process by far.
Right. We have 37 vulnerability assessments up and down the state. Right? How many? 32. I'm sorry, 32. I got that wrong.
Well, you know, that's 32 more than
32 out of 76. That's pretty good.
Okay, great. Who wanted to go next? Oh, Commissioner Hart.
I just have a couple questions. First of all, I know that there's the Safeguarding California Adaptation Plan. Is that the most current plan statewide?
Yeah, so the safeguarding plan is updated routinely. I think it's every 5 years. And the way we've been talking about these different types of guidance documents is Safeguarding sets up the entire statewide approach to climate change more broadly, so not just sea level rise. They have a coast and oceans portion, which we've worked with them on. Ocean Protection Council has their own state sea level rise guidance, which again gives slightly broader overview in terms of recommendations and best available science. And then our sea level rise policy guidance, points that down a little bit more detail specific to the Coastal Commission's planning and permitting processes. So how do we use the projections that OPC has suggested that we use for different types of projects? And so we're giving more guidance on LCP and CDP specific contexts.
I would add that, our guidance is really focusing down on actual planning and where the rubber hits the road as it comes to adaptation planning. So we have, that's where we're at with our residential adaptation guidelines, is that deeper dive down into the actual development of sample policies and ordinances on adaptation. And then we have a companion project that we're working on critical infrastructure, looking at across the state of how are we going to plan for sea level rise and with our critical infrastructure and pulling all that information together.
Right. So I know that's a couple, 3 years old now, but it was sort of a broad document, so it's good to hear. But I wanted to ask, there's so much planning that's been done, and yet, if you look at what happened yesterday, I don't see it being actually applied in terms of infrastructure construction. We're seeing the plan that we are moving forward with, or that Caltrans is moving forward with, doesn't seem to incorporate what we just heard. But be that as it may, it just makes me feel like we're planning, and we're spending so much money on planning, and we need to be executing. And with regard to that, I was wondering if you could comment on if there has been any collaboration or coordination with the Air Resources Board and the potential for greenhouse gas the offset funding to be applied to these kind of projects.
Yeah, and we are receiving, 1.5 million a year from greenhouse gas funding for our efforts around planning. So 750,000 of that yearly allocation goes to our local government partners for planning, and the other 750,000 goes to supporting our staff efforts on developing guidance. The problem with that, there's no positions that come with that, so we have to absorb that within our existing staff. So this is a challenge we face, and our local governments face, is getting enough, having the resources to conduct these, these planning efforts at the local level and at our level. We simply do not have the staff capacity to deal with the level of planning that is necessary to make this a successful program, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, I personally feel very strongly. I agree with Commissioner Bochco's, Chair Bochco's idea of forming a pilot project here at Humboldt Bay, going to ARB, trying to get more funding and positions, and to begin going beyond planning and starting to look at moving infrastructure out of the way. And I'm happy to help in any way I can with that effort.
Anyone else? Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I concur with those recommendations that are coming from my fellow commissioners. And I would extend that, a lot of this focuses on infrastructure. And again, ironically, a lot of it is fossil fuel infrastructure, which is what is, in essence, driving the changes that we see on the planet and that we're dealing with here. And so I want to make sure that we take that into account in the way that we move forward, because I think we're going to be hopefully changing a lot of things, not just where we put levees and how we move things around, but fundamentally changing societal and ways of doing things. And I want to make sure that we talk about, but then also to understand that it's not just infrastructure, there are ecological changes that are occurring. These are the fringes of our land and water systems. These are estuarine systems. These are the most biodynamic and bioproductive systems on the planet. They're the nurseries for many, many species. So these fundamental shifts, if we aren't taking them into account in a way that understands that, we're looking at collapse of food systems. We're looking at the collapse of economic systems that rely on these ecological infrastructures. And so we cannot miss that in this discussion. We keep talking about pipelines and roads, but there are, we're talking about these fringe habitats, which, we have large land masses and large oceans, but some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet from an ecological and economic perspective are these estuarine systems. I want to make sure that they're accounted for in that discussion. I think one of the opportunities that Humboldt County and Humboldt Bay has offered in this discussion, and although we don't view it sometimes as an opportunity, is and maybe we shouldn't, but it is in some discussions, is that our real estate values in general are, an order of magnitude less than in other parts of the state, and has made it so that we can be a little bit more comfortable about this discussion to a certain level than maybe an area where you have multi-million-dollar houses, one after another, after another, after another, after another. That is not a feature of our shorelines in general. On the other hand, we have vulnerable communities in those same locations, which maybe in other places would have already been developed in these ways. And so, in some ways, addressing some of these issues is not as a huge of a economic burden, maybe to the state, to help out with that. And I think we've been having somewhat very honest conversations about this over the last 5 to 10 years, where maybe some parts of the state have really, that conversation can be a lot more painful. And so from that perspective, I'm glad that we can help lead the charge in really looking at some of these issues. And I would submit that maybe there is a time now that we've had these long history of disaster movies. We've had them for tornadoes, and we've had them for tsunamis, and we've had them. Maybe a sea level rise disaster movie is something that will get people's attention. And they're all sort of exaggerated, and certainly if we had something that exaggerated it to maybe even 1 inch every week of sea level rise, the worldwide consequences and human migrations would be a dynamic thing to witness, even in a cinematic perspective. But what I'm saying is that, that sort of awareness, I think, is something that needs to happen. And so I want to thank the staff and my fellow commissioners for elevating this, and for Alderon and John for being here today to help tie it together with regards to where Humboldt County's at. And so those are my comments today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that wants to speak? Okay. Well, thank you for a really wonderful presentation, and clear and frightening. So does anyone want a break, or okay. We're going to take a 10-minute break till 11 o'clock. Thank you.